good afternoon, colleagues. Warm welcome from me. It's lovely to see many familiar faces and names popping up on my screen. But for those of you who don't know me, I'm Helen Martin, one of the directors of the Gateway Alliance. It's lovely to welcome our Maths Network back together in the spring, online again, but obviously making the most of the technology in order for us to be able to come together and continue to meet and access this development over this time when we're not able to see each other face to face. Delighted that Viv's here today. Obviously, all of you know Viv in terms of our Maths Network lead, and very pleased to welcome Craig Barton to lead our session today. We were very much hoping that Craig would be with us face to face, and this has been in the planning for nearly 2 years now, I think, hasn't it, trying to organise a date. But we've got second best, we've got online, so that should be great. Just before we start, I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping. Please, if you could keep your microphones muted whilst the session's running, that does help in terms of background noise. But if you want to put your cameras on, that's great as well, because some feedback for Craig in terms of faces and smiles as he's going through his presentation is always great. And obviously, if you're contributing in at any point, then please do put your microphone back on. There will be several breakout rooms that will be facilitating through the session. So it is really, really important to put your cameras and your microphones on at that point. If you have got problems with your camera or your microphone, please do put it in the chat, and so I'll be aware of that, because in the breakout rooms it'd be good to know who isn't going to be able to engage in those. So please do let us know. There is a chat facility. I think most people are quite familiar with Zoom within the network now from our meetings before. So if you click on chat, which should be an icon on your menu strip at the bottom of your screen, you can put any questions or comments throughout the session into there. Viv's going to be monitoring the chat, and we'll collate questions for Craig towards the end of the session. Obviously, we'll be able to share your comments and feedback whilst with Craig at the end of the session as well, or throughout if appropriate. The session is being recorded, so an edited version of the recorded session will be shared with the network on the members area of the website, as it is normally at the end of this session. So if you do miss any bits or you need to leave, then it will be there for you. But just to let you know, the breakout rooms are not recorded, so please don't be concerned about talking about things in the breakout rooms that you don't recorded. It's not recorded, so that's just your own personal space there. I think that's all I need to say in terms of housekeeping, so I'll pass on to Viv just to say a quick hello and introduce Craig, and then we'll get started. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. Lovely to see you all, everybody. Welcome to crikey, January. Welcome to January. So I just want to, on behalf of everybody here, welcome Craig. Really, really fantastic that he's able to be with us. And just a really brief introduction. So apologies that I'm going to read. He's been a maths teacher since this is one of those embarrassing things. I'm hopefully not going to say anything sort of. You can tell me afterwards, Craig, whether what I've taken from your website is accurate. And so Craig's been a maths teacher since 2004, working at various schools in Formby and Bolton. He's co-created the website Diagnostic Questions. He's the secondary maths advisor at the TES. And among other things, he regularly runs workshops, keynote addresses like this, works with maths departments sort of around the world, really. He's currently a visiting fellow at the Mathematics Education Centre at the University of Loughborough, which is exciting. He built the MrBartonMaths.com website in 2007, and since then it's been used by millions of teachers, students and parents around the world. He's also got a Mr. Barton Maths podcast. I think these are really interestingly named. I don't know how you came up with these names, Craig. And he's interviewed people around a world who are big in the world of education. So we've got Doug Lemov, Dylan William, Daisy Christodoulou, Dan Meyer, lots of good people there. 2 great books Craig's written in the recent years. The first of those, How I Wish I'd Taught Maths, came out in January 2018. And I think a lot of what we hear about today will be associated with that. And the second book from 2020 is Reflect, Expect, Check, Explain. Got to make sure I've got those in the right order. So I'm sure we'll hear more about the contents of some of those today, but Craig, really, I'm personally really looking forward to hearing from you today, and I'm sure everyone here is as well. So thank you so much for joining us. Over to you.
Cheers, Viv. Hi, everybody. That'll be a massive anticlimax now. That was a very good build-up from Viv. I might take you on tour with me around there. That was good, that. Like a hype man. That was very good. Thank you for that. Hello, everybody, and thank you for making the time to come to this. I know this is the world's worst time to be teaching. I know everybody's absolutely knackered and on their knees at the moment. So thank you for making the time for this. I'll try my hardest to make it as useful as possible, because I know every minute's precious, either to be planning lessons or just spending family time or just switching off and so on. So I'll really try my hardest to make this as useful as possible. I'm just going to share my screen, which will take me just 1 second just to set this up. So just bear with me for 1 second. And once we're up and running, we'll be good to go. And I've just got to switch to presenter view, and there we go there. Helen, could you just give me a wave if you can see my PowerPoint screen? Oh, look at that, perfect. Okay, it's a good start. Right, so we're going to be talking tonight about one of my all-time favorite things to talk about, because it is controversial. A lot of people say I talk absolute nonsense about this, and it has been completely transformative for what I do day to day in the classroom, but also, and this is the bit I'm particularly interested in tonight, how I've had to adjust in the new situation we find ourselves in. Whenever I was researching all this particularly for my first book, I never in a million years thought that I would be delivering CPD like this or working with my students like this and so on. But the new reality we find ourselves in now, it's really interesting. A lot of what we're going to be talking about tonight feels more relevant than ever. And that'll be a challenge that I'm going to lay out for you as when we go in the breakout rooms is, when I start talking about things and presenting ideas, how does that fit in with the situation you find yourselves in? And does it feel relevant? And what will you need to do to make it work for you? I just want to mention a couple of things before we start. All the ideas that I talk about tonight, they've come from 4 sources, really. And the first 2 are the research that I did for my first 2 books that they've kindly mentioned before. I read around about 500 research papers and about probably 60 or 70 books to put together the content for those 2 books. Wherever possible tonight, and it'll be pretty much all the time, anytime I come up with an idea, I'll tell you the exact piece of research that it relates to. So if you wanted to follow it up, you're more than welcome to. The kind of second main source is my podcast. I'm very lucky to interview the world's leading educationalist on my podcast, covering all sectors: early years, primary, secondary, higher education, and so on. And a lot of the ideas tonight have come from my guests saying, have you read this or have you seen this? And then I've gone off and read it and so on. And perhaps the most important source of what we're going to talk about tonight is the experiences I've had over the last, what's it been now, this is my 3rd year of my kind of official secondment from my school in Bolton. I still, anytime I'm lucky enough to have a bit of downtime, when I could go in face to face, I'd still take intervention classes, and now wherever possible, I'll do remote teaching. But since I've kind of not had my full-time timetable, I've been lucky enough to travel around the world working with teachers and students who've taken my real basic ideas and found ways to make it work for them. So tonight I'm going to be sharing with you lots of examples of teachers and students who've taken these ideas on board and found ways to make them effective. And the main thing we're going to be trying to get to the bottom of tonight is, how do we get our students, how do we give them the best chance of thinking hard about the right things? Now, that's important in a classroom, but if anything, it's perhaps even more important in the situation we find ourselves now, where students are either taking part in live lessons online, or they're being set videos to watch and activities and so on. How do we help them focus their thinking? What are some of the key guidelines that we can follow to help keep them as focused as they can, potentially when there's loads of other distractions going on? So 3 things before we start. The first is, I am in no way going to be able to cover everything. This is normally a day and a half session that I talk about now. If you were interested in learning more, I've converted all my big 7 talks that I do into online versions, and they're available from craigbarton.podia.com. If we have time at the end, I'll take you on a bit of a tour of that, because there's 8 completely free courses as well on manipulatives and various different things as well. But if what I say tonight interests you, the kind of full in-depth version is available to purchase there. And if you get in contact and mention that you've been part of this session, I can give you a discount on that one. The second thing is, as Helen mentioned, there's going to be lots of opportunities for kind of breaks for you to go into your breakout rooms. This is your opportunity to discuss things, obviously, with your colleagues, and challenge the ideas that I come up with, because as I say, a lot of people say I talk nonsense on this stuff. and also potentially in the nicest possible way, argue with each other. If you have a different point of view, just go for it there. And that brings us to the third thing. I won't be monitoring questions throughout this session. What Viv is kindly going to do is she's going to collate kind of the best of in terms of the questions, and I'll try my hardest to finish kind of 15 minutes before the end. So we're booked until R5, but I'll try and finish about 5:15. And then Viv will fire a few questions at me, and I'll try my best to answer them. The chances are I'll say I don't have a clue if they're particularly hard questions, but I'll try my best to answer. So what we're going to do now, if it's okay with Helen, we're going to put you in your breakout rooms to start off with, just to test that this is all working and give you an opportunity just to introduce yourself to your colleagues in your breakout rooms. And also, I want to know where you're at. So if I say to you the phrase working memory, what does it mean to you? And what, if anything, what role does it play in your teaching? So Helen's going to put you all in breakout rooms. If you've any problems with mics or videos, this will be a good opportunity just to drop a message in the chat, and Helen and Viv can sort that. So we'll just do 2 or 3 minutes just to say hello to each other. And working memory, what does it mean to you? And what role, if any, does it play in your teaching? So you should receive an invite very shortly to join your breakout room. Perfect. Welcome back, everybody. So yeah, hopefully if all goes to plan, you'll keep in your same breakout rooms throughout this, and there'll probably be kind of 5 or 6 opportunities for you just to come together and, as I say, discuss, question, argue, and so on and so forth. So just to give you a bit of a flavour, that is all the things I talk about when it comes to focusing thinking. There's so much in this, and I was absolutely clueless when I first started researching this. I knew absolutely none of this. Now we're going to get nowhere near finishing this tonight. My aim is to definitely give you the theoretical overview, because I think it's really important, and immediately that starts to suggest a few practical things. So I want to give you a bit of just briefly, we won't get too bogged down in it, but just a bit of a theoretical overview of the 2 major theories, the 3 major theories we're going to be talking about. And then I want to focus on the practical things, what it means day to day in terms of face-to-face in the classroom, and crucially, what it means in terms of online. And what I want to finish with tonight is something brand new, something I've been working on in the last kind of week or so, which is what are the direct implications for teaching online, particularly for Mayer's 12 Principles of Multimedia, which have a lot to say about some of the videos we set our kids to do, some of the live lessons that we do online, and so on and so forth. So let's dive right in with a word of warning. Now, this isn't just one word of warning. This is about 17 words of warning. So the first thing to say is I'm a secondary school practitioner. I don't have a flipping clue about primary school. You could not pay me enough money to teach in primary schools. Like, I struggle enough to get my head around maths, but when you chuck English into the mix and all the other things, no chance. So I can only speak from my experience. The only thing I will say in my favor is that I go out of my way to work with our feeder primary schools as much as possible, and I always end up learning more than they ever do for me. And I've been very lucky over the last 3 or 4 years to work with lots of groups of primary school teachers all around the world. And once again, it's always me taking notes there. So always bear everything I say with a pinch of salt in terms of the kind of experiences I'm talking from. A lot of the examples I'll use tonight are secondary because it's the only thing I know about, and I can speak about what happened with my kids. So a challenge for you will be to think, does this relate to me in my context? And if so, how? The second kind of word of warning is, as I say, a lot of people say I talk nonsense about a lot of things, but this in particular. So what you're going to be hearing tonight is my interpretation of some disputed theories. So you've kind of got a bit of a double negative there. The theories might be dodgy, and what I'm saying about them may be dodgy. That's why I will always cite the references in my online course. There's, after each short video, there is a direct link to the piece of research, so you can follow it up if you want. I hand on heart, I sound like a dodgy salesman here. I believe wholeheartedly in everything I say, but please be aware, and I'll flag this up explicitly when we get to it. This is by no means a non-contested set of ideas and arguments that I'm going to put forward tonight. Okay, so you've been warned. Right, so the 3 theories we're going to talk about tonight all revolve around a very simple model of how memory works. Now, it's bizarre this. I taught for probably 12 years without ever thinking about memory. I spent time getting frustrated that my kids would forget things, but I always blamed them. I never really stopped to think, was I doing anything in my teaching that was causing my students to forget things? And it's only when I started kind of reading research that I realized that there was this whole sway of research into memory that I was completely ignorant and naive about. So I'll just give you a very brief overview of what I learned over the last few years in terms of memory. So at a very, very basic level, you've got your working memory, you've got your long-term memory. Crucially, working memory is where all thought takes place. That's where processing happens. So when we're trying to teach our students a new idea, a new concept, a big thing, all their thought takes place in working memory. Now, they may take in information from outside, so things that we're saying to them, things that they're reading, things that they're hearing. They may also take knowledge that exists in long-term memory and bring that into working memory to process it. So mixing new stuff with old stuff, trying to make sense of this new idea that we're hopefully trying to teach them. Now, the problem is with working memory, it's got a finite capacity. Students can only think about so much at any one time. It's constrained. Now, some students are lucky. They are born with a big working memory capacity, and that makes thought a hell of a lot easier. Some students are unlucky. They're born with a shorter, a smaller working memory capacity. As far as I'm aware from my reading of the research, there is nothing we can do to increase working memory size. There are little things you can do like brain training or memory palace and things, but they work in a very specific domain. They can help you remember 52 cards in a sequence. They can't help you solve a mathematics problem any better. All we can do is we can help our students more successfully process that thought by doing some of the real practical things that we're going to focus on tonight. Long-term memory, on the other hand, as far as we know, has an infinite capacity. The problem is with long-term memory that some memories become inaccessible, some memories get muddled up with other memories, and so on and so forth. But what we're focusing on tonight is this initial bit, this initial processing. What is it that we can do as teachers to help our students focus their thinking so that this limited capacity is focused on the stuff that's going to contribute to learning, as opposed to stuff that's going to fill up this limited capacity but not contribute to learning? And as I say, it blew my mind, some of this stuff, because it just alerted me to the millions of mistakes that I was making as a teacher without realizing it. Now, we're starting getting controversial now. This is where it all kicks off normally. A lot of the advocates of the three theories that we're going to talk about tonight have this notion that they define learning as a change in long-term memory. So they say that what happens is when some information is successfully processed, so some new idea, whether it be something to do with fractions or decimals or whatever it is, some new idea that we're teaching our students in the moment, if it's successfully processed in working memory, then what happens is that fundamentally changes long-term memory. It either adds a new piece of knowledge in there that wasn't there before, or it adds something new onto some existing piece of knowledge, or it fundamentally changes a misconception. But it changes, if students successfully process something, it changes what's going on in long-term memory. Now, the problem with this is that this is just a model. This isn't really what happens in students' brains or so on. But I sit on the side that I find this quite a useful thing to think about, because it really helps me see that there's kind of two parts to learning that we'll talk about in a second. Students have to successfully process something in the moment, but also then they have to be able to successfully retrieve it over time for me to get a better idea that they've learned it. So you get this notion from Paul Kirshner, will be a big advocate of this. Learning's defined as a change in long-term memory, and he goes one step further. If nothing's changed in long-term memory, nothing has been learnt. Now, Paul's very controversial paper on this is why minimal guidance during instruction does not work. And this is where you start to get a big divide in maths education versus at one end pure discovery and at another end pure explicit instruction, and it all starts getting a bit murky and kicking off. We're not going to get into that tonight. All I'll say is that I personally find this quite a useful model to think about when I'm thinking in terms of learning. If you want to know more about this, you can read all of Paul's work, but I was also lucky enough to interview him, and I talked to him directly about the controversies in this paper, and I put to him directly some of the criticisms that people have put forward, and we'll talk about those criticisms in a few minutes' time. So if you're interested, it's quite a controversial and quite an interesting listen at that particular one. So we get this notion of memory. If nothing's changed in long-term memory and nothing's been learnt, but when things do change, perhaps new connections get made, perhaps new items of knowledge start to come. That's what learning looks like in terms of this model. Now, as I say, I see learning as two things. I see it as first that initial successful processing. If kids can't take in that idea that we're teaching them, that idea that they're thinking about, if there's too much else going on in working memory, if it's starting to get overwhelmed, they've no chance of learning things. But also, and this is a whole other story, if they then can't retrieve that over time, then you get this frustrating cycle of teaching where kids seem to get it in the moment, but then the next day they've forgotten it, the next week they've forgotten it, and so on and so forth. So I see kind of two aspects to learning. We're going to focus on this first bit tonight, this successful processing, and what we can do as teachers to help focus our students' thinking. But please be aware, that's just one side of the story. If we don't then schedule in these opportunities for students to try and retrieve things over time, those memories start to decay pretty quickly, and students get really frustrated because they know they used to be able to do something and they can't do it anymore. A couple more things I want to say, and then I'm going to shut up and give you an opportunity to reflect upon this. We're going to focus on 3 theories tonight, all of which have something to say about focusing thinking, about practicing good practice for teachers. And what I'm going to do is try and bring these 3 theories together. Often they get presented separately. I'm going to try and take the commonalities between the 3 of them and ask myself, what does that mean for us in our classrooms? And now, what does it mean for us teaching online? So the first one is the most famous one and also the most controversial one, cognitive load theory. Now, it was all kicking off for cognitive load theory back at the start of 2017 when Dylan Wiliam bangs out what's probably the most famous tweet in education history, where he comes down and says it's the single most important thing for teachers to know. Now, that stirred up, well, it did 2 things really. First, it brought naive people like me to the notion of cognitive load theory. So I started reading everything I could on it, but it also started to stir up a backlash, which we now see. And we'll talk about this in direct criticisms in a second, about people who say, no, we've got too obsessed as a profession on the findings from cognitive load theory, and it's very, very limited, but we'll talk more about that in a second. So cognitive load theory is based on this notion that working memory has this finite capacity. And what we need to try and do is try to manage the load. They use this phrase load, manage the load imposed upon students' working memories. So load is simply what students are thinking about, how strenuous the thing that they're thinking about is. Now, depending which papers you read, there are either 2 or 3 different types of load, different things that students are thinking about in working memory. When the theory first came out, when John Sweller from Australia first started talking about the theory in the early 80s, he defined 3 different types of load: intrinsic, extraneous, and germane. Now, as I say, we're not going to get too bogged down into the theoretical things. I'm interested in the practical, but I just want to show you where this is coming from, if that's okay. So just take a moment, if you haven't read this before, you're not aware of these definitions, just have a quick read of these 3 different types of load. Now, interestingly, well, if you're a nerd like me with this kind of stuff, over the last few years, Sweller's changed his mind and he just groups these 2 together now. He just has extraneous and intrinsic load. And in essence, we have the bad stuff and the good stuff. What we want our students to be thinking about, we want all of the stuff that they're thinking about to be this intrinsic load. We want it to be related to how complex the idea is. We want it to be all the stuff that they put this effort in and it helps them learn because they're thinking about the idea. But what Sweller's point is that a lot of what students think about is this extraneous load. It's stuff that is not related to the big idea we want them thinking about. It's stuff that fills up their working memories. It starts to clog things up, but it is in no way directly related to learning. And what I realized when I was reading this stuff, my jaw was on the floor because I realized that my teaching for many years was this. It was rammed full of extraneous, not through any deliberate kind of actions on my part. I just was naive to all the mistakes I was making. And as we'll talk about tonight, I thought I was doing the right thing. But when I think about it now, I realized that I was actually making it harder for my students to focus on what I wanted them thinking about because my teaching was rammed full of extraneous load. And what I try and do now, it'll never be perfect, but in essence, I try and reduce the pink stuff, reduce the bad load so that my students have got more attention that they can think about maths. Because that's what I want them thinking about. I want them thinking about the mathematical idea that's at the core of the lesson so that they've got the best chance of understanding it, successfully processing it and learning it. So the focus of tonight's session is going to be, what do we as teachers do inadvertently to make thinking harder for our kids, and how can we remove it so they can focus on the stuff that's going to help them learn better? That's going to be the aim. Just a couple more things before I shut up and give you a chance just to say whether you think I'm talking rubbish with this. The other key concept that we're going to talk about tonight is this notion of cognitive overload. And this is when working memory just reaches its capacity. So imagine that you're doing a lesson, perhaps online, or maybe back in the day where we could actually see our kids face to face, and the kids are trying their hardest to process it, but they're having to do more information, and then something else comes in, then something else comes in, then something else comes in. Eventually what happens is this: they get to the point where they simply can't take in any more stuff. And this, for the advocates of cognitive load theory, this state is called cognitive overload. And it's a really dangerous state for two reasons. One, because no learning takes place. Nothing can be successfully processed when kids are overwhelmed like that. So if we're hoping kids are thinking about, the concept of a fraction on a number line or whatever it is, if they get to this state where they're simply overwhelmed, they can't successfully process that idea. So nothing gets changed in long-term memory. And if we remember the definition, if nothing changes in long-term memory, nothing gets learned. But the second reason this is really problematic is because this looks like kids struggling. If you watch students, if you walk into a room, or perhaps you're teaching or watching a screen, and kids are scratching their heads and writing things down and so on and struggling, it's really hard to distinguish that productive struggle where they're kind of working at the edge of their capabilities, they're really straining to get something, versus it's gone too far and they're just overwhelmed. Both look quite similar. Now, there's no way we can distinguish. There's no way we can measure, working memory capacity, what they're thinking about, and when it tips over. We can't do anything like that. But for me, the concept of cognitive overload is a really useful one to think about, because what I can do as a teacher is I can try and make sure that I limit wipe out some of the things that my kids are having to wrestle with and think about, wipe out those extraneous things, those things that aren't related to learning, so that my kids don't quite, or fewer of my kids, reach this kind of stage of overwhelm, this state of cognitive overload. So again, that's our focus tonight, is going to be on what are some of the things that we may do as teachers that start to fill up our students' working memory, but not in a way that contributes to learning and potentially can lead to this state of cognitive overload. Just a couple more key ideas, then I promise I'll shut up. I want to address this head on. I'm going to tackle two criticisms in a second, but I just want to straight away tackle this very common misunderstanding, because people who critique cognitive overload often say it's about making thinking easy. That what it's about stripping away all the complexities and giving kids, in my case, easy mathematics to do that they just breeze through. That's not it at all. Now, if any of you got sensitive to bad language, now's the time to kind of cover your eyes. So I'm going to share with you a quote from Paul Kirshner that I was lucky enough, when I watched him speak at Research Ed National a couple of years ago, he shared, and he kind of addressed this misunderstanding head on. So just have a read of this quote. So this, for me, is the key to it all. What these kind of practical takeaways from cognitive load theory and the two other theories that we're going to talk about, what they're interested in is thinking about working memory and trying to they're not about that. It's not about taking away the complexity, taking away all the stuff that makes learning hard. It's not about that. What it is about, it's about identifying the stuff that isn't contributing to learning, getting rid of that so that students have got more attention, that they can focus on the good stuff, the stuff that's going to contribute to learning. So what this actually means is we can give our students more challenging work to do, really push them to their limits, to their potential, because we're identifying the things that are just making thinking harder, but not in a useful way. So if we were to, and I get slated for saying this, but if one way to think about our jobs as teachers, and obviously there's so much more to teaching, relationships, pastoral, love of the subject, and so on, but one important kind of way to view teaching is to try and identify this extraneous load, this negative stuff, this stuff that we're doing without thinking about it, that's making life harder for our students, reducing that so students can focus more on what will help them learn. Before I just let you go into your breakout groups, just to discuss cognitive load theory in particular, I just want to face two, tackle head on two criticisms, and two very good criticisms of the theory. Then I'm going to shut up just for a few minutes, you'll be pleased to know. So the first criticism is that cognitive load theory, and the two theories that we're going to talk about as well, have no practical applications whatsoever. Now, a real keen kind of advocate of this theory is Dr. Helen Williams. Now, I know Helen fairly well, and lucky enough to interview her a couple of times on my podcast. They're always interesting conversations. She doesn't mess around, doesn't Helen, especially when she knows that she knows more about something than I do. She really gets me kind of focused and thinking about it. Now, we've had some discussions about cognitive load theory directly on the podcast, and Helen's point is that all this is just a theoretical model. We've got no way of measuring what's going on in working memory. Working memory doesn't exist. There's no biological thing in our head that's working memory. Same with long-term memory. So, and Helen particularly doesn't like this bit. What on earth, she says, what on earth does that mean? How do I know if something's changed in long-term memory? So how do I know if my kids have learned something? I think it's a completely fair criticism. This is simply a model, but I find it a really useful model because it gives me something to focus on in my teaching. When I'm planning a lesson, when I'm designing a video, when I'm thinking of setting some work online for my kids, I now have this concept of extraneous load in my head. And I think if I can reduce that, if I can remove some of these things that are clogging up my students' working memory, it doesn't matter if I can't measure it perfectly. It's only going to be doing them good, because it's allowing them more attention to focus on the right stuff. So I believe, and again, you'll be the judge of this, I believe this is incredibly practical, because there are things that you'll be able to do tomorrow when you're thinking about your lessons that will, I have no doubt whatsoever, improve the focus and attention of your students and enable them to think and learn better. But as I say, you'll be the judge of that. So I understand the criticism, but I find this an incredibly practical theory. There's so many takeaways for me from this. And the second criticism is this, and I get this a lot, that this is just bloody obvious. This is the most obvious thing in the world. Why on earth am I sitting here doing a workshop on this? Because every good teacher knows this. Now, a real kind of key advocate of this is Jules Dolby, who, again, many of you will be aware of, and I've been lucky enough to interview Jules on my podcast as well. And just have a read of Jules's tweet there back from late 2018. Now, those of you aware of Jules' work will know that Jules is very big in the world of SEN, and her point is that well, in particular, teachers of students with special educational needs need to be aware of this, need to be aware of focusing attention and so on. But this kind of criticism goes a bit wider than this, that actually this is just common sense. It's just all obvious stuff that if you're a half decent teacher, you do. And again, if you're interested in hearing us discuss and debate this, I was lucky enough to interview Jules. You can look all these up on my podcast. But I'm going to put my hands up here. I taught for 12 years. I thought I was a really good teacher. My kids did well, got good Ofsteds, got good results, and so on and so forth. I didn't know any of this, and I didn't do any of this. So it may be obvious to everybody, but it wasn't obvious to me. Some of these things have fundamentally changed what I do day to day. So again, I understand that some teachers may just do this naturally or as part of their well-considered kind of pedagogy, but I certainly didn't. I certainly didn't. Right. So I'm going to just shut up now for a second and just give you an opportunity just to reflect on cognitive load theory in particular, just for 2 minutes. I'm interested in your take on it. What's been your experience with cognitive load theory? Have you had training on it? Has it impacted your teaching? Have you done any wider reading on it? Have you got any concerns with this talk of working memory and long-term memory and so on? And here's something else I'd like to be thinking about. I keep talking about this notion of extraneous load, these things that we are doing as teachers, which are making it harder for our kids to think about the big idea. Can you already think of things you may be doing in your teaching, either live or online, that may be contributing to this extraneous load? Because I'll tell you what, I did a hell of a lot of it and still do, and I'm going to be sharing that with you when we come back. But what's your view on cognitive load theory, and what's your view of this extraneous load? Can you think of anything you're doing now that may be contributing it? So Helen, if you could fire up the breakout rooms, if that's okay, and I'll call you back in a few minutes' time. Right, so just to tie up a couple of things on cognitive load theory, and then we'll move on into the other two, which I'll do very, very quickly. Firstly, I'm a maths teacher. That's all I know about. But cognitive load theory has got wide applications. It's particularly relevant to maths, I think. But also it's got things to say about pretty much every subject or any type of learning, to be honest with you. By far and away, the single best guide I've found on this is by the Department of Education from New South Wales in Australia. It's a free PDF. So if you just Google cognitive load theory in practice PDF, it's the first thing that comes up there. And this, I'll drop in a few of these examples as we go through tonight from other subjects, whether it be music or geography or whatever. So obviously, if you've got colleagues who are leads for other subjects in primary, or just yourselves out of interest for other subjects, this is about as good as it gets in terms of a real easily digestible practical guide. So the second theory, and we'll just do this very briefly, this is the forgotten one. I always feel sorry for this one. It's the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. But I'll tell you what, once people kind of remember this one, this is going to be talked about, I reckon, over the course of the next 6 months, the longer this kind of lockdown and online learning goes, because this is all designed, all this theory talks about is how students learn better with different media sources going on, whether it's visual, auditory, and so on and so forth. Now, Richard Mayer is the kind of main person behind this. It's got all the same assumptions as cognitive load theory in terms of the limits of working memory, with one extra twist, but a really important twist. And that is that working memory is not just a single vessel. It's actually divided up into two channels. You've got the auditory one that processes sounds, that's the phonological loop, and you've got the one that processes all things visual, pictures, and so on, which is the visual spatial sketchpad. And what's really important here to be aware of, and God, I didn't have a clue about any of this, is that sounds and images are processed in separate parts, separate channels in working memory, both of which can get overwhelmed, both of which can get overloaded. So what this is going to teach us very, very soon is that if we can tweak our PowerPoints, our worksheets, our videos in a way that kind of lends itself well to how working memory processes things, we can actually make it more likely that students will successfully process the audio, the visual stuff that we want them to. So it's going to tie in really nicely with cognitive load theory, but just give us that extra bit of insight in terms of the type of information that we want our students thinking about. And the final one is the trendiest one at the moment, dual coding theory. I mean, 12 months ago, this was all over everywhere. If you didn't have a poster of this up in your room, you weren't a good teacher. Everyone was chatting about this. Oliver Caviglioli is your kind of main man about this. And dual coding theory is all about how images and text can be more carefully integrated to allow students to better understand things. But again, it's all to do with this notion that working memory, we can only think about so much at any one time. So let's try and design what we want our students to be thinking about as carefully as possible, so that it allows them to use all their limited attention up to the best of, to the most appropriate use, if that makes sense. So what my plan of action is tonight is we are going to take the key lessons from those three theories, cognitive load theory, cognitive theory of multimedia learning, and dual coding theory. And I'm going to show you a couple of ways, probably 3 or 4 ways, it's directly changed what I do in a classroom and when it comes to online lessons. If you want to know more of this, as I say, my course on focusing thinking, this covers absolutely everything I know about this. It's a 1.5 day long thing. You can just dip in and dip out whenever you want. So if you want to know more of it, it's there. But I'll try and give you a couple of really key ideas tonight, if that's okay. So let's start with a really super quick one. I like to get things up and running with a dead simple practical thing that you can change straight away, and that is to use what's known as the modality principle. Now, if I sound like if I'm sounding like I know what I'm talking about here, don't be fooled. I was completely clueless of this up until about 3 years ago. Now I knew nothing about this. So I use this exact example in my first book, and it's quite a good one because I use this in lesson many times. I'm a big PowerPoint user, so I would do a PowerPoint slide like that for my kids, or if I was doing notes on the board on a non-interactive whiteboard, I'd do it like this. Or if we think about the situation we find ourselves in now, you could well imagine that being a slide on a video of an online lesson that we're doing and so on. And what the modality principle says is that we can improve that. We can make a very simple tweak to make that information there much more easy to digest for students. We can remove the extraneous load. Now, what's interesting about this is for us as adults with competent literacy skills, this is absolutely fine. We can process all the information there. But you'll know far more than I will with younger students or students who struggle with processing words and so on. And this can be quite daunting. This can be quite demanding. And we can improve this using what we know about working memory. So this is where this modality principle comes into play. Just have a read of that if you're not aware of it. So it's this idea that an image with somebody talking over it is much easier to process than an image with that same text next to it for students to read. Now, that may seem a little bit counterintuitive. And what I want to say from the outset is this is by no means saying that we should never have text on the screen. And in fact, the very next thing I'm going to talk about after modality is how to make that text as effective as possible. But what this is saying is that actually text in an image is quite problematic to process. Because what happens is images are getting processed in this visual part of working memory, but text, when we first see it, that also gets processed as an image. We've got to read that text. We see it visually first. So when you're reading text, you're seeing it as an image. And also, if you've got an image next to it, you're seeing that as an image as well. And we can start to overwhelm this channel of working memory, the visual spatial sketchpad, that processes images. So the question is, what do? We still want our kids to get that same information that they get from the image and the text, but we don't want to overwhelm them visually. Well, this is where the modality principle comes into play. And what that says is, and again, by no means is this saying get rid of text altogether, but what it's saying is, whenever you're first introducing a new idea to kids, perhaps a new big idea, where possible, get rid of the text and narrate what you were going to say initially. Now, the text can come later, and we're going to talk about good practice for that text next. But initially, an image and narration is easier to process than an image and accompanying text. And Maya sums this up really nicely. Just have a quick read of that. So this is what I mean about making the most of this split nature of working memory. If we can get students processing an image and narration, we don't risk overwhelming one of those channels. So what can we do with this? Well, one thing we can do, and again, I believe this is just as applicable face-to-face as it is online learning, is if I want to teach my students about exterior angles, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a bright, bold image. I'm going to strip away everything else. So my students are just focusing on that visual, and then I'm going to talk. I'm going to talk about angles. I'm going to ask questions about angles, but I'm doing it all verbally. Now, I can add things to the diagram, and as I say, the text can come later, but I'm not going to overwhelm with a slide that has an image and text on. First, I'm going to allow my students to process the image, and then I'm going to discuss, I'm going to narrate, I'm going to say what the text was going to say before I add the text on. Now, I can do that very simply with a static image, or I can do it with dynamic images. And as a maths teacher, I'm incredibly fortunate. We've got wonderful tools like GeoGebra with people far smarter than me can build wonderful interactive applets that mean that students can focus on a dynamic image whilst I talk over the top, and they don't risk this visual overload that would potentially could occur if there was that image with accompanying text alongside. Now, as a secondary maths teacher, I make use of a lot of GeoGebra. For any of my graphing stuff, I make a lot of use of Desmos. But also for teachers of any age group, I'm a big fan of mathwarehouse.com. It's a US site, so they leave the S out, so mathwarehouse.com, because they've got loads of GIFs and pre-animated GIFs that you can just paste into any PowerPoint, any presentation at all. And again, notice there's very little words around there. So my students can focus in on that image. I can talk, we can discuss, ask questions, and I'm tapping into both channels of working memory and hopefully not risking overwhelming that visual part. I mentioned before this wonderful PDF, Cognitive Load Theory in Practice, an example for music there that notice that on the slide, you've just got the treble clef and the time signature and so on, and you've got the teacher describing what it says, perhaps pointing and indicating, but students are not being overwhelmed with that text around the slide. It's this notion that sometimes less is more, and that certainly seems to be the case with an image and text. Now, again, disclaimer, and I'm going to come to this directly, this is not me saying we should never have text on slides. Text is going to play an incredibly important role, but the way I use the modality principle is more often than not, when I'm introducing a new idea for the first time, strip away all the text, have a big, bright, bold image, let me explain, let's discuss, and then the text can come in later. So very briefly in your breakout rooms, and what I would like to think is, firstly, do you buy into that modality principle? Is it something that you think has got any credence? Does it got any legs that? And does it have any implications for your teaching, both in the classroom, but also the situation we find ourselves in now? Perhaps think about the next lesson that you're delivering online or you're setting students' work and so on. If it's a new idea, can you harness this modality principle? Can you perhaps introduce a key idea with a big, bold image, strip away the text, and then the text can come in later? So what can you do now if you buy into this to tap into this modality principle? We'll just do 2 minutes if that's okay, Helen, in breakout groups. So you'll get your invites now. What do you make of this modality principle? Okay, welcome back, everybody. So that's the modality effect. That's probably the quickest one, and quite an easily actionable one. But what we turn our attention to now is a real biggie, a real big one here that's got lots of, for me anyway, lots of practical takeaways, lots of things for me to think about and reflect on in my teaching, and it's the split attention effect. So if you're not aware of this, and perhaps the best summary of the split attention effect is that. Just have a quick read of that. Now, the key here is this multiple sources of information, whether we've got students reading text, looking at an image, listening to something. Again, this has got huge implications in classroom, but also perhaps even bigger implications when we think about the situation students will find themselves in remote learning. So we're going to talk a lot about this. So with the modality effect, there's kind of just one takeaway. With split attention effect, I think there's at least three. So we'll go through them each in turn, and then I'll allow you to go into your breakout rooms and think, what does the split attention effect, if anything, mean for you, and what impact is it going to have on your teaching? So the first, and perhaps maybe most important, I don't know, but is when it comes to text and diagrams. So we mentioned before with the modality effect that when we're introducing an idea for the first time, perhaps we get that text away and we just narrate and discuss. But that text has got to come back at some point. As Sweller points out, if we're just doing all our explanations verbally or orally, then you have this transient information effect where if the kids aren't listening at the moment, it's gone. They can't just whereas with text, it's got a permanency. Kids can reread it several times when they're ready and so on and so forth. So text, and by the way, when I'm saying text here, if I think from a maths teacher's perspective, I'm also talking equations, sums, and so on, any symbols, anything like that that needs to be processed visually first, that has a really important role to play. I can't just do everything orally. So the text has to come. The question is, how does it come? So I'm going to show you some pretty shocking examples of text and images that really fall victim to this split attention effect. So I think I can improve my slide for a start. So we'll come back to that in a second. But here, I mean, this is horrendous. This is one of the worst I've ever seen. So this is from a very well-known textbook. The content itself's hard, but don't worry about the content. Just try and read it and try and take in what it's saying and see if you notice anything. Now, the problem you've got here is, imagine you're a student, a novice learner, and you're trying to get your head around this. So you start, your attention's down here, since J. Then you think, where the flipping X J? So you've got to have a look here to find J. Then you're back here, lies on the perpendicular bisector of AB. Where's A? Well, there's A. Where's B? There's B. Now I switch back here. Is equidistant from A and B. Where's A? Where's B? What's happening is you've got this switch from this mode of information, text, to this mode of information, an image. And every time students have to switch attention from those mode of information, it has a cognitive cost. It's extraneous load. That switch takes up students' attention, but not in a useful way. Doesn't help them understand this geometric concept any better. It just makes that processing of information that much harder, which means they've less attention to dedicate to the core idea because it's all being filled up by this extraneous load with a poor presentation of this material. And this is from a very, very well-established textbook. Now, you see this in exams all the time, whether it's SATs, GCSE, A-level, whatever it is, and questions that fall victim to this split attention effect. So you get something like this, where you've got an image here, and then below you've got the text that refers to that image. You need them both. You can't get rid of either of them. But for students to properly understand and follow this, it's quite difficult. B, C, D are points on the circumference of a circle. Well, let's have a look. There's B, there's C, there's D. Then I switch back, then I switch back, then I switch back. Now, it may seem like a really minor thing, this, and it may not have, like, it's not going to have a revolutionary impact on your kids straight away. But this presentation of information is not doing anybody any good. If we can improve this, it may just be that thing that just tips a student over from not quite getting something to getting it, because they can just focus their attention a bit clearer on the core mathematical idea. This presentation where they've got to switch from here to here, here to here, does them no favors whatsoever. Board work is really interesting when you model solutions on the board, particularly when an image is involved. So imagine that this is either in a live lesson or you're doing this online and you're talking through students how to do a solution, or perhaps it's a pre-prepared slide that you've got off TES or whatever, and all the solutions are there, or from White Rose or wherever it is. And the solutions are separate from the image that they refer to. Well, the problem is it makes it really, really difficult for students to follow it, because they're thinking, what does this refer to? They're looking, where's that to? Well, that to's here. And their attention becomes like dedicated to a search. They're searching around for the relevance of this solution to the image, the text. How does it relate? It's doing them no favors in understanding the mathematical idea. This was a low point for me. I spent about 6 years building up worked examples, work solutions to every single GCSE paper. Now, twist 1, they changed the specification, so I was fuming about that. Twist 2, it turns out these solutions are a load of rubbish, because again, the source of information here, the image, is separate from the text, which makes it really difficult for a student who's struggling with some solution, struggling with a worked example, to try and follow it. And it's just that really obvious thing that we can really improve the presentation of worked examples of solutions to problems just by more carefully integrating, as we'll talk about in a second. A final example, this is a shocker. So AQA, one of the GCSE awarding bodies, this is one of their worksheets, official worksheets. I'm a big fan of AQA. This is the bottom of page 1, solve that inequality. Top of page 2, use your answer from part A. So now you've got to physically switch, right? It's not just look up and down, you've got to turn the paper. And it sounds like a daft thing, but that is only going to make processing that information harder, but not in a useful way. If you imagine a kid who's really struggling with inequalities, that isn't going to help them. It's not going to help them one bit. So this kind of split of text and diagrams is an issue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present a potential solution to this. And it's not rocket science, this, but I tell you what, it can't have been that obvious to me, because I wouldn't have been making these mistakes over the years. So what we get is what's known as, at its most basic level, and this is a posh word for a really obvious thing, the spatial contiguity principle. Just have a read of that. So the very basic notion here is that if we're going to be using an image and text, we want them to be really carefully integrated so students' attention can focus on one place at a time. They don't have to switch. Now, the rest of the world outside of the classroom uses this all the time. Like if you get any good instructions, I mean, that's terrible. That's a horrendous to follow. Whereas that is much better. Now, there's a real obvious thing that's happened here, and that is that the text has become better integrated within the thing it refers to. But there are also 2 other things that are perhaps a bit more subtle. The first is that the text has been broken up into smaller chunks. So no longer do students need to follow big sentences, or you can imagine big, like 5 or 6 lines of working out. It's broken up. But the perhaps even more subtle thing is the labeling, the numbering of these steps. This is something that eluded me for many, many years. Think how important this numbering is. Now, at the time, let's imagine you're modeling a solution on the board or via an online lesson. The kids are following. They know you've written this first because they've just seen you write it. They know you've written that second because they've just seen you write it. But let's imagine that they're taking notes, so you're going to share this screen with them or something at some other time in the future. They're going to be looking back at this at some point in the future. Without those numbers there, they've no way of knowing where to start their thinking. They don't know where this solution or what order these notes are in. Whereas when they're numbered like this, attention straight away goes over here. Then it goes there, then it goes there, and so on. Students' attention is focused. It's the exact same information, but it's much more easy to process, so more attention can be focused on the big ideas. So how does that relate to the examples that I've shown you before? So work solutions now, I'm really, really careful when I do work solutions to integrate them together and label the steps so my students know where to focus their attention first. Now that is really important on this one here, because imagine it didn't say step 1 and step 2, and you were to look back at this next week, your instinct is that you start your reading up here, whereas that's the second thing that I did, because people read top to bottom or left to right. So this numbering of steps is really, really important. Exams are terrible for this. GCSE, SATs, A-level, horrendous for this. Now, the thing is, kids are going to need to answer questions that look like this, with the diagram and the text split. But that doesn't mean that the best way to get students good at that is to keep giving them presented like that. Because the important thing is that we help them understand the big idea first, and then we can worry about how it's going to be presented in exams later. Giving students practice questions that look like this is only going to make learning that big idea harder. So what some teachers do, and I think it's a really smart idea, is they take exam questions and they break them up. They remix them to not fall victim of this split attention effect. They label the key points on there instead of having that text as some big thing that needs reading and deciphering. The deciphering can come later. That's the second part of the problem. The key thing first is understanding that mathematical idea. This is my favorite non-maths example. I think this is really, really, really good. I like this. So it's a biology example. You might not be able to quite read the words, but that doesn't matter. That isn't bad. You've got things labeled here. That's pretty good. But notice you've got to go from here up to here to read what it is. Whereas take the same diagram, but integrate those labels better. And all of a sudden you can focus your attention exactly where it needs to be. You don't have this split going on that you would have normally. Now, just when did I do this? This December just gone, I interviewed 10 researchers from Loughborough University about their chosen field of research. And Beth, who's a PhD student, her chosen field of research is maths textbooks from all ages. She does focuses on A-level, but she's looked at all primary textbooks, secondary, from UK and overseas. And she interviewed students about what type of textbooks. She showed them loads of different examples, what they prefer, what they find easiest to understand. And the textbooks that students struggled with the most, their least favorite one, the ones that they found least amenable to them learning, were the ones that fell victim to this split attention effect. The ones that had text and image, or text and working out, separate from each other. Like sometimes you'll see in a box on the left-hand side of the page and it's separate from what's going on. That is hard to follow. And kids struggle, whether it's in textbooks, whether it's in PowerPoints, whether it's in worksheets. So this split attention effect, the most obvious application is when it comes to text and diagrams. Just before I ask you just to reflect on this, just one more thing. I want to tie the two ideas together, this modality principle and the split attention effect, because they almost seem to contradict each other, but I don't think they do. So the first time I introduce a new idea to kids, I have the image with no text. I give them time to look at it. I'll ask them a question. They'll do a discussion. I'll explain something. It'll all be verbal. And then when I come to add the text and add the label, I'll have labels on and I'll carefully integrate that text within the image. So I can use both lessons. I can use the modality effect when initially presenting an idea, and then I can try and avoid this split attention effect by carefully integrating text and images together. So my challenge to you, we'll just spend 2 minutes on this. What do you make of the split attention effect? Think about your slides that perhaps you're using for online teaching, or videos that you're setting for your kids. Have they fallen victim to this split attention effect where the text and the images are separated? Think of some exam questions or textbooks or worksheets that you may use. Is there any way you can harness the lessons from the split attention effect, perhaps with the modality principle as well, to improve the presentation of your materials to your students? So again, we're just going to spend 2 minutes, Helena, on this, if that's all right. So if I can ask you to go to your breakout rooms now, what do you make of this first aspect of the split attention effect? Perfect. Hello, everybody. Right. Couple more things from this split attention effect. As I say, it's not just one thing with this one. Now, this next one is big. This had huge implications for me when I was classroom teaching. But again, you know what? I reckon this is even more deadly for when we're teaching online, if we're doing live lessons, or if we're setting videos for our students. Once you're aware of this, you see it absolutely all over the show. And that is talking when text is on the screen. This is bad, this. So let's think, what happens when you talk over text? So I mentioned before how text first gets processed as an image. And that's why there's a real danger that we overwhelm students with a load of text and a load of images, because they all need processing at once. But once text has been processed as an image, text essentially gets read out loud in students' head. It's like you have an internal monologue that processes this. It's like inside your head, it's saying, excuse me, what happens when you talk over text, like a sentence going on in your head. Now, what actually happens there is that part of text, when you're reading it out loud in your head without realizing it, that's being processed as a sound. It's being processed in the phonological loop. It's an auditory noise, even though it's happening internally. Now, that's fine as long as nothing else needs processing in that phonological loop. And the problem is, when I reflect back on my teaching, what I was doing is I was giving students two conflicting audio channels, two things that they needed to process. I was giving them text that they needed to read, and then I was speaking over the top. So I'm going to show you just how bad this is. This is a real life example from one of my lessons. So let's imagine you're one of my year 7s, and we've just had a brilliant time learning about fractions. And at the end of the lesson, I'm going to give you a problem from Enrich to solve. And genuinely, with no word of a lie, this is what one of my lessons would look like. So I would project this up on the screen, and then I would start doing this. Right, I want you to read this super carefully. If you're stuck on anything, remember, look back on your notes because we did this previous lesson. You can talk to the person next to you as long as you're talking about maths. Please set your work out really carefully. Underline your final answer. You must show all your work in. Now, the kids must have just been thinking, just shut up. Please, 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 will you just shut up? Because what's happening here is you need silence to read the text because although you don't know it, you've got this internal dialogue going on in your head, this internal monologue in your head that's trying to process those words. And as soon as another audio stream comes over the top, you've got a conflict. It's both being processed in that phonological loop, and working memory is very bad at processing two things at the same time like that. An image and text, no problem. Sorry, an image and narration, no problem. But narration and reading, that is a huge, huge, huge problem. But this happens all the time. Now, it's really interesting, this. I've been on the lookout for this. So this whole lockdown and this online teaching has provided a really interesting experiment little mini experiment that I've been running myself. So I do this all the time. I never give my kids enough time to read text before I start chatting. And for many years, that was because I kind of feared silence. I thought silence was a sign of no learning taking place. And if anybody was watching me, I'd just be chat, chat, chat all the time. So I thought that was the best way to teach. So it's hard enough to do this in class, to be quiet and let kids have time to digest it. Or for me, it was anyway. But I'll tell you what, I think this is even harder to do online. Because there's almost a thing where if you're doing live teaching online, you almost want to fill the void. You want to keep talking to perhaps make sure the kids have got something to check they're still concentrating, check they're still focused, G them up and so on. Perhaps you haven't been talking to anybody for a bit, so you quite like chatting and so on and all this kind of stuff. But the problem is it only makes processing that text harder, if not impossible. Because the best thing, if you're my students, the best thing you can do here is either cover your ears or close your eyes to try and cut out one of those audio streams that's happening. And I used to get frustrated at my kids because I'd say, like, they'd do something wrong. They wouldn't follow my instructions. And I said, well, weren't you listening to me? Well, they were trying to listen to me, but they were also trying to read at the same time. So this is a big, big problem that I faced a lot in my teaching. So what's the solution? So the most obvious solution is to shut up. Is whenever kids have got something to read, whether it's sentences, whether it's a problem, whether it's an algebraic expression, a sum, whatever it is, they need silence to process it. But if you've got something important that you want them to listen to, so let's say, for example, you've put a problem up and you actually want to say something about the problem, like you want them to set it out in a certain way, or you want to draw their attention to a certain bit of it, then like a really bad thing to do in the classroom, and I see if you spot the problem with this, is you say things like, okay, don't look at the words, look at me. Well, even the kids who weren't looking at the words are now looking at the words, so that doesn't work. So what I need to do, if I've got something important to say about the text, if I don't need the text there, I'll blank my screen. So I'll press B and the screen will go. So B in terms of PowerPoint for online lessons or in the classroom is a really, really useful thing because instead of like unsharing the screen and so on, which can be a bit fiddly, just pressing B means the kids have got nothing to look at there. So it draws attention to the voice straight away. Or I will just explain to the kids, look, it's really hard to listen and read at the same time. So what I want you to do, I just want you to listen to me for now. And then I can draw their attention and highlight certain things. So if I've explained to the kids why it's important that they don't try and read and listen, perhaps that can work. But as I say, if I've got something important to say, I really want the kids to not be looking at the text. So it's either be on PowerPoint, or if it's a worksheet, ask them to turn their worksheets over or make sure they're looking up and so on, because I don't want them trying to process text and narration at the same time. One more takeaway from this. Oh, in fact, no, actually, I'm really sorry to be a pain, Helen. I just want to give people just a very, very short opportunity just to reflect on that. Particularly, I'm interested firstly, whether you've fallen into that trap in the classroom, if indeed you think it is a trap, talking over text. But also, I'm interested in people sharing their experiences, perhaps over this week, or perhaps in the previous lockdown, if you've experimented with any live teaching online, or perhaps you've set a video for kids to watch either from Oak or White Rose or wherever it might be. If you've watched that video, do you see people do this? Do you see people talk before kids have had an opportunity to read the text? Is this a problem you recognize? And can you find a way to stop yourself doing it? Because I find it flipping hard. So I just want to give you just 1 minute, if that's all right, just in breakout rooms. What do you make of this takeaway from split attention effect, not talking when text needs processing? So you just go in your breakout rooms now, if that's all right. Perfect. Welcome back, everybody. Right, just one more thing from split attention effect that I'd like us just to reflect upon. And then I'm going to switch attention just for the kind of last bit that I'll be speaking about, just to some specific things about online teaching that may or may not be useful to you. Now, this next one had big implications in terms of the classroom when we were talking face-to-face. But the more I think about this, the more I think this could also have some relevancy in terms of online. So I'm just going to just talk you briefly about this in terms of the classroom, give you my thoughts about online, then again, just ask you just to reflect on this briefly. And that is movement. So if we're talking now about focusing thinking, we're talking about students having this limited attention. And what we want to happen is as much of that attention as possible to be focused on the key mathematical idea. And we've spoke already about if text and diagrams are split, that's going to make that thinking that bit harder. If we're talking over text, it's going to make that thinking that bit harder. But movement's a really interesting one. Now, movement in terms of in the classroom itself has got lots of big advantages. It's great for relationships. And again, the more teachers I speak to, that's one of the things that they're finding the hardest about this situation that we find ourselves in now is it's very hard to maintain those relationships with students. You can't just have that friendly, just hello, how's it going? What did you do last night? All that kind of thing that used to be so easy. So moving around the class, being able to speak not just to the people at the front of the class, but at the back of the class is really good for relationship building. It's great for behavior management. Again, if you've got a ropey table at the back, you can get round to them, check everything's all right. They know you're on to them and all that kind of thing. So that's great for that kind of thing. And it's also good for fitness. I have my watch on here, got a daily competition going on with my wife. And that's one thing that's really absolutely nosedived in the situation that we find ourselves in now. So it's great. Movement around the class is great. And it's really interesting just to reflect how much of that we lose, of course, when we find ourselves in this online situation that we're in now. But, and this is the big but, movement, and as I say, I'm going to relate this to online teaching in a sec. Movement when we're giving explanations and instructions is potentially really problematic. So if you imagine that you're sat in a classroom, you're one of the kids in a classroom, and perhaps you're sat near the middle or to the back, and the teacher's walking around the room whilst they're giving an explanation and an instruction. As the teacher gets closer to you, your attention starts to move away from what they're saying. And so you start thinking things like, oh God, why is he coming over here? What's he going to say? Oh no, I'm in trouble. He's not going to pick on me. He's not going to ask me a question, blah, blah, blah. So your attention starts to shift away from the words to the movement of the teacher, to the location of the teacher in the classroom. Now that's a problem for the kids because it diverts their attention. Their limited focus in working memory diverts it away from the big idea. It's also a problem for the teacher. If you've ever experienced this, let's say you're walking around just anywhere, to the shops or whatever it is, and you start thinking hard about something, then you tend to stop. You tend to stop walking because you know at a subconscious level that you need to dedicate all your cognitive power to that thing that you're thinking about. So in the classroom, what I've really started doing now is I still move around as much as I normally would. I like to move around when the kids are working, although there's a whole other side of this where if you hover over a kid whilst they're working, does it disrupt them and so on, and the concentration and so on and so forth. But I still like to move around the classroom for those reasons that I outlined before. But at the point where I'm giving an explanation or an instruction, I'll tend to stop. I'll be in one location, always at the front of the class with eyes pointing to me. I'll tend to put my hands behind my back so I don't have the tendency to move my arms around and so on and so forth. And I'll speak. And that means my students' attention is on the words that I'm saying and not on my movement. Now, what's interesting, that's all well and good in the classroom, but what does that mean for us in terms of online teaching? Now, it's really interesting this. And again, I don't know your situation. I would imagine that there's a mixture of people doing kind of live lessons online. There's also some remote work being set, perhaps videos being set and so on. It's really interesting. There's a real split. I can only speak from my limited experience in the secondary community of what teachers do in terms of their videos. So I would say the majority of teachers will have their videos on for perhaps all of the lessons so that the students can see them. But of course, there's a real danger that potentially that becomes distracting. If you're giving an explanation out and the students' eyes are on what books you've got behind you, or have you had a shower today or something like that, then all of a sudden they stop thinking about the words that you're saying and they start thinking about other things. And now, again, it may seem like a real small thing, this, but if we're wanting to focus attention, let's say we've got something on the screen that we really want them to concentrate on, we can really harness that modality principle and that split attention effect by getting rid of the camera for that amount of time so that they can focus on what's on the screen and listen to the words. And then we turn the cameras back on, so it's not like a robot speaking to them and it's face to face and we can do whatever it is that we need to do. But possibly there's an argument that when we're given instructions or explanations, maybe the camera goes off for that. Now, I'm not saying that that is the thing to do, but I'm just saying if you follow the research kind of to the letter, potentially that's one of the implications from it. The other thing to say is movement can have a really positive effect. So when you're in the classroom, and like, let's say I'm talking about gradients of curves, it can be anything. I can get my arms going around, I can point, I can gesture and so on to use my movement to draw students' attention to what I want them thinking about. Now, again, when I do this online, this is a lot more difficult. This is one of the things I found the hardest. It's just a simple act of pointing isn't as easy as it used to be, just tapping on the board. What I need to do now is I need to get out, whether I'm using a graphics tablet or the Apple Pencil or whatever it is, or I have to use a pointer on my clicker. But I can really harness, if I'm not moving all the time, if I'm being selective with my movement, I can really use that movement to draw my students' attention to where it needs to be on the board. But I think there might be an argument of restricting that movement and potentially even removing perhaps our faces and the students' faces for certain points in the learning, whether it's instructions and explanations, so that they can really focus on them. Now, I'm interested again, just for 1 minute, what's your take on that, both in terms of the classroom? Are you a mover? Are you a mover around the classroom? Are you a mover at the point where you give explanations and instructions? And do you think, like me, that potentially that might be a bit problematic? And what about this when you're giving explanations and instructions in an online setting? Have you found that students are getting distracted? And is there a way that you can use the technology possibly to turn off the videos or whatever to harness that? I don't know your individual situations, but perhaps this is a good time to tell the person in your breakout room what your current setup is, what you do in the classroom, what you do online, and what you make of this notion that potentially moving whilst giving explanations and instructions might be potentially distracting for students. So Helen, for the penultimate time, I reckon it is, please can we go into breakout rooms if that's all right? Perfect. Welcome back, everybody. Not long to go now. I'm just going to talk for about another 10 minutes or something like that. And then it'll be over to you if you've got any questions. And I'll let you go back into your breakout rooms for the final time, just to see if there are any questions, anything that you would like me to address. Just on that, I was just chatting to Helen and Viv just during that break. Yeah, I've no evidence to support this whatsoever, but I would wager that the majority of you will speak more on an online lesson than you would live in the classroom. And perhaps you won't even notice you're doing it. That I notice I'm doing it when I do CPD sessions. And the reason is, like, you lot are very good. I can see 5 or 6 of your faces now, which is great for me, because I know if I tell a joke and I get no reaction, I'll cut that out of the set for next time. But what's brilliant about it is that's as close as I can get to getting some kind of reaction. Often when we're teaching, we have the kids' cameras are turned off for safety reasons and so on, or the kids choose to turn them off and so on. So you get no feedback whatsoever. And I think it's human instinct when you're getting no feedback just to keep talking. Hopefully you fill any void. Why say things one way when you can say it 17 ways? So if we think that talking whilst kids are trying to process and think is problematic, as I say, I think it's potentially even more problematic in the situation that we find ourselves in now. But as I say, just my theory on that. Now, there is a hell of a lot more that we could talk about here. I've not even touched the redundancy effect, which has got huge implications. I've not talked about, and it all kicks off when I do this, I've not talked about so-called fun and engaging lessons and why they may be potentially problematic. And I'm not even going near classroom displays because I get things thrown at me when I talk about that. So we won't go there. But if you're interested in any of that, as I say, on the online course, I talk about all that and more in depth, and there's links to all the research and so on. And what I wanted to finish on tonight is just to think specifically again about teaching online. Now, I mentioned Richard Mayer before. He's the guy behind this cognitive theory of multimedia learning. And he has what are known as the 12 principles of multimedia. So 12 guiding principles for making the most of using videos, PowerPoint, talking, and so on and so forth. Now, these haven't been designed with school children in mind. These are generic principles to help anybody learn in any situation when multimedia is involved. So some of these, there are 12 of them, we'll just go through each one very briefly. Some of these you may look at and think, well, that's absolutely no relevance whatsoever. And some of these we've covered already tonight, but I think there are a couple of nuggets here that are worth just thinking about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through all 12. And then I'll leave all the 12 on the screen so you can just have a moment on your own just to take them in. So don't feel you need to be writing these down as they go. And then I'm going to ask you to go in your breakout rooms just for the final time, just to see if any of these feel relevant or important in whatever individual situation you find yourselves in terms of teaching remotely at the moment. So I've got these that you can find these anywhere, but a really useful site I found is this Water Bear Learning, because they have some really nice visuals of this. So if you just Google Mayer's 12 Principles of Multimedia, you get this straight away, but it's Water Bear Learning. I'll put that reference up at the end just in case you find this useful. So we'll go through each of these. So you get the coherence principle. Just have a read of that. Now, this is kind of related to the modality principle that we're talking about. It's this notion that less is more, particularly if you're going to be talking about things, just have the bare bones on any visual or any slide. You can add things later. It's very hard to take things away because the damage has already been done. Students are already confused or trying to process things. So I always start with the bare bones, then if needed, kind of add things later. And I try and make sure that wherever possible, everything that kids see is relevant. Now, this has implications. Some of my favorite, if I download a lesson from TES or wherever, Resourceaholic, often you'll have like the school logo on the slide, or you'll have some learning objectives or the date and so on. If we're going to take this through to the letter, they shouldn't really be there whenever we're focusing on some mathematical idea, because if they're there, kids have to filter them out. They have to ignore them. I want whatever's visible to be as directly and pertinent to that learning idea as possible. So it's worth just looking at the slides that you use or the videos that you use and just look at what the kids are seeing. Is there anything there that you can get rid of? Is it a date? Is it whatever it is? Is it a border? Whatever it is there something that can go that can just mean that students' attention is focused on the germane and not on the extraneous. This is nice. Just have a read of that signaling principle. Now, again, we've got lots of ways we can do this. We can do this using bold. We can do this using different colors. We can use highlighters, whatever we can use arrows. But it's all too possible to go the other way. Now, I'm not naming his name just to be safe here, but we have a colleague at our school who every email he sends, some bits are in bold, some bits are increased font, some bits are in italics, some bits are red, some bits are blue. You don't have a clue what to pay attention to. You feel sick looking at it. So you don't want to overemphasize things. This signaling principle, use it sparingly. What's the key thing you want students thinking about? And if it changes throughout, then we need to get a bit dynamic about it. If we need to highlight this bit in bold first, well, then we're going to remove the bold and put more bold in for a different thing and so on. So again, it's all common sense, this, but it's just nice. I like these set of principles just when I'm thinking about PowerPoints and videos, just to try and tap into them. Just have a read of this one, redundancy principle. Now, this is something we didn't get around to tonight, this whole redundancy principle. There's so much of this, but a real obvious one is, and I've broken this already tonight because it's so hard not to, and that is to read out text that's on the screen without giving kids time to read it first. Because you're asking kids to read, but also listen, and it's the same thing that they're reading and listening to. So it's really redundant, and it's very hard to kind of, do you not listen or do you not read, or what's going on there? And it's this notion again of just shutting up. Just giving kids time to either listen to you, so just listen to you with no text, or read without you talking. But I tend to do both because I thought, well, if I just speak whilst they're reading, it'll be better for them, but it's not. So you get this notion of redundancy. And often it'll be like the literacy levels of the students will determine what's best. If they're strong readers, then allowing them to read in their own time with no noise to distract will be better. If it's quite complex, then perhaps narrating it first without that requirement for them to read, and then adding the text later on may be best. So redundancy principle, really simple one, but a really important one. We've talked about this one, this spatial contiguity principle, this notion that things, again, it's obvious. Why would you not do this? Why would you not closely integrate it? But it's amazing, honestly, when you're aware of these things and you're on the lookout for them, you see these rules being kind of broken all the time. So just aware of that. More carefully integrating text and images on the screen. This is an interesting one. Just have a read of this. Now, this is related, Maya here is talking about video production, but this is just as relevant to just teaching live using a PowerPoint or whatever it is. You want what you're saying to be directly related to what's going on at the screen. You don't want this kind of temporal gap between them. You don't want kids to have to remember what you said and now kind of relate it to what's being on the screen, or somewhat confusing to be on the screen and then you explain what it is later. It's just thinking up, again, obvious stuff, maybe not relevant at all, but it's just nice to have it as a kind of guiding principle. Have a read of this one. Now, this is one of the benefits of remote learning, or whatever we call it, teaching online. Particularly if students can have, well, if you're setting a video, then this works straight away. Or if students can have access to the recording of the lesson, this can work really well because students then have control over it. They can go forwards, backwards, pause it, revisit it, and so on and so forth. What this segmenting principle is saying is are the kids aware of this? Do they know that they've got control over it? Or do they just see this as lessons have always been, where they've just got to watch it at the speed of whatever the teacher's doing? They can't skip bits, they can't go back and forward and so on. So what May is talking about here is making it really explicit, the kind of advantages of this new medium that students are being presented with. Just a few more of these. And this, I don't know how relevant this is, just have a read of this and I'll just share my thoughts. Now, this kind of may be seen as flipped learning at its kind of most extreme. But where I think this is directly relevant is just making sure kids are aware, particularly of the expectations that go on in terms of online learning. There was a wonderful thing that I've not shared here, but I must remember, if I can find it, I'll send a link through to Helen, of someone on Twitter who has a symbol on every PowerPoint slide for what kids' expectations are at that point, whether they should be listening, whether they should be writing, whether they should be thinking, and so on and so forth. Just being aware of the principles before the lesson starts can really just help kids not come into it cold. You don't get this cold start problem. Just a couple more. We've done modality principle, limiting the amount of text that's used whenever the teacher's talking so that students can focus their attention on the image as opposed to on the text. And then you get this one as well. Just have a read of this, a multimedia principle. Now, I think there's a danger you can go too far in this as well. And I've been guilty of this as well. I love a bit of clip art now, right? Because it looks nice on the slides, but there's a real danger that if it's not relevant, it's distracting. It needs to be filtered out. Kids need to decide that it's redundant. Now, there's no doubt that the thing on the left is better than the thing on the right in terms of it being visually appealing, but it's got to be relevant to what's happening. Filling slides up like I used to do with clip art, animations, things bouncing in left, right, and center, it can be really detrimental to students' focus. So it's harnessing the visual with the text, just getting that right balance between providing enough information and relevance, but not overwhelming like is happening over here. Just a couple more, and then I'll shut up. Now, again, this is something that I would consider to be fairly common sense. This is something that if you've ever been to a presentation given by somebody who's not a teacher, they'll often fall foul of this, where all the buzzwords, I mean, teachers do it as well, to be honest with you, but all the buzzwords are coming out, all the long words. Why say it in one syllable if you can find a 5-syllable word that'll do it? And we know that keeping things as concise as possible, as brief as possible, and as clear as possible is the way forward with this. But I like this. Keep your message simple and casual. It allows learners to feel more comfortable. Like, kids are getting more used to this environment now, but we still know it's very daunting, very unusual. So the more we can make them feel familiar and that it's still us, their teacher, doing the teaching, it's just using a different medium, then the more that they can stop worrying about that, the less anxiety they'll have about that, and the more they can dedicate their attention towards learning. And the final one, this is an interesting one. Just have a read of this. And there's been studies into this, and it's no surprise, but like the more kind of inhuman the voice is, so you get these that can like retype in text and it'll read it out, like Alexa and all that kind of thing. They're getting really, really good now, but it's been shown that kids don't learn as much. It needs to be clear, the audio, but it needs to be clear that it comes from you, that it comes from a human, and so on and so forth. And this is why it's really interesting. I did a bit of work when Oak National were setting up all their videos during the first lockdown. I was just involved in just like a bit of a working party group about it. And one thing they really wanted to make sure of, if you've not used any of the Oak National stuff, it's all completely free, is that the kids felt a sense of kind of continuity with the teacher. They didn't want it if like the year 5 maths lessons are all taught by the same 1 or 2 teachers, so that the kids got familiar with it. They didn't want it to be like one person does this one and then next time you watch a video it's something else, because you don't get this familiarity, you don't get this, and so then you start thinking about the person and their voice, and it's all different and it's weird and it takes you away from it. So yeah, just a nice clear voice, but a friendly human voice is the key. And finally, this goes back to what we were saying about cameras before. It's really interesting in video, professional video presentation, doing lots of these talking heads and actually having the kind of face on screen is thought to be relatively bad practice, because you're not adding anything to it. You're only taking away, you're only distracting. But again, I think we can go too far the other way. I wouldn't want my kids to log on and not see my face, because then they don't know it's me and it feels weird and so on. But too much of me is always a bad thing. So perhaps, again, just minimizing every now and again, turning off the camera so they can focus and so on and so forth. So they are Mayer's 12 principles of multimedia. As I say, they're not designed with teachers in mind. They're designed just generally for using media presentations to anybody. But I just thought they were interesting just to share and consider in this situation we find ourselves in. And as I say, you can get them all from Watervale Learning. So for the final time, what I'm going to ask you to do now, I've overrun, I always do this. Breakout rooms things for the last time. You can, by all means, you can talk about these 12 principles of multimedia, but it's also an opportunity. If you've got any questions that you would like me to answer in the kind of 7 minutes that we'll have left, just think of them and then you can type them in the chat when you're ready. So Helen, for the final time, can people go into their breakout rooms just to reflect on principles of multimedia and if there's anything you'd like to ask? Perfect. Okay, welcome back, everybody. We've got 5 minutes left. I won't keep you a second longer, I promise. Viv's just got a really good question that she's going to ask me now. Whilst Viv's doing this, if you've got any questions yourself, feel free to frantically type them in the chat, and I'll do my best to answer as many as possible. But Viv, do you want to go ahead with your question?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. I was just thinking, I've been doing quite a lot of online teaching, not of children, but of sort of trainee teachers and adult learners, I guess. And one of the things I've been very conscious of is the sound of my own voice. And the fact that, like you say, I think I talk more online than perhaps face to face. Martin is nodding. That's very rude. But one of the things I've been trying to do is if there's text on the slide, actually getting other people to read that text aloud, so that I'm changing the voice. And I just wondered how that fitted with what you've been talking about today.
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant question, Viv, and it's a really smart strategy. First thing to say, big disclaimer, there'll be no surprise to everybody. I'm by no means qualified to talk about literacy or reading or anything like that. You lot will know far more about this than I will. But there's a couple of things there. I think it's great to have that variety in the lesson, particularly when the situation we find ourselves in now, where again, it can be potentially a passive experience, sat here kind of listening. It's almost like a lecture every day for the kids. They get this staring into the screen. Perhaps they don't get a chance to talk and so on. So I think that variety is really important to make kids feel more included in the learning as well. The only thing I'll say is, and again, it's a really, really obvious point and everyone will know this, where this goes wrong is if text appears on the screen and then kids straight away you say, Anna, just read that out, or Tom, just read that out. It's this opportunity for kids to process it first, to just have that initial opportunity just to read it and take it in themselves. And then we can say, Anna, just read that first line, because there's a key concept I want us all to focus in on here. But yeah, I'd always want kids to have that opportunity just to process it themselves first. It only needs to be a few seconds, and then their reading over the top can then really help. It's like a double opportunity to get it, if that makes sense. Yeah, good question. If there's any other questions coming through in the chat, feel free to yell them out. Oh, just one thing I did see, Mark asked as well about this. I thought this was really important as well. Mark said that the personal aspect of children seeing you in an online lesson is possibly more important for the children to keep that relationship. Yeah, I completely agree with that. I would never, ever have a lesson where I wasn't visible for the vast majority of that lesson. The only point I was saying, and I'm not saying it's definitely a good idea, but perhaps if there's a bit where you really want the kids to focus, perhaps there's something really important on the screen and something really important you want them to listen to, maybe that's an opportunity just to perhaps remove the videos temporarily and then bring it back. I interviewed Peps McRae, who's written a load of wonderful books. His most recent one on motivated teaching's excellent. On one of my early interviews with him, he spoke about something he did as a teacher, which was if there was something he really wanted the kids to listen to, he'd dim the lights in the room, almost like a cinema effect. He'd dim the lights, and he just said the kids just went so quiet and focused, and then he'd talk and draw their attention to the board. So I think it's kind of a similar thing. You can almost use the novelty of, turning off the videos temporarily to focus the kids and then turn them back on to maintain those relationships. We've got like literally 90 seconds. If there's any other question, feel free, but obviously no obligation at all.
There's nothing else that's come into the chat. I don't know if anyone is busy typing furiously and is about to press send. Mark's also suggested that perhaps having a set of rules for the children to follow. And is that the sort of thing that might be part of your pre-training? That sense of how we behave online, is that part of what you'd suggest there?
I think so. It's just like anything. It's like the expectations that you'd set up for the kids in September or whatever in the classroom. It's the same thing for online, and it's those things that need to be as clear as possible and continually reinforced and reintroduced to the kids. Yeah, I think that's a really smart idea from Mark there.
Lovely, thanks, Craig.
Well, this is if we one more's coming. Look at this last minute. Charlotte snuck in there. Oh, and it's quite good as well. It's just a nice one, just saying that she likes it and talking about online teaching. So thanks, Charlotte. That's very, very nice to end on there. Yeah, I'll just a final word for me. Just thank you again for giving up your time. I know it's knackering doing these at the any time, but at the end of a day and at the end during this particular term as well. But I've enjoyed this as well. There's been some good questions. Yeah, and I've really enjoyed this. So thank you again. I'll just hand back to Helen or Viv just to wrap things up.
Thanks, Craig. Thank you so much for your time. There's been loads that we've been able to take from this, and I really hope that people have been able to take a lot from it, even though at the time of day that we're at and the week that we're at. I'm going to post in the chat as I do a link to our feedback form. If you could just click on the link before you leave and complete that afterwards, that would be great. It's really good to get your feedback and help to feed into how we can use what we've learned today to feed into more sessions that we move into in the future. Obviously, just to point out that 1st of March, Craig will be back with us for a second session on a different topic. So obviously all the Warwickshire colleagues who buy into the full programme will have that. The Walsall colleagues can choose to attend both if they choose, but it'd be great to, looking forward to welcoming you back, Craig. Thank you, colleagues, for engaging today, and hope you have well, enjoy your remote teaching and your work now. Good luck with everything, and we look forward to seeing you on the 1st of March, if not again before. So thanks again, everybody. Lovely to see you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.